So one of the best explanations I've heard to try to explain what a fourth dimension of space, we're not talking about time right now, only space, what that would be like. I first heard from Chuck Missler, and it's a phenomenal presentation. He goes through this thought exercise called Flatland. I did have to watch it about 10 times to really get it.
Okay, so it's not just me.
No, this is everybody. It's totally fine. But the exciting thing is you can get it. Anybody can get this. It just takes some time because we're not taught this. I believe if we were taught this stuff from early on, it would be like second nature. We're never going to be able to visualize in our heads the fourth dimension ever, but we would at least kind of understand the concept of it better. So Chuck Missler, and he wasn't the first to do this. Like any physicist that talks about dimensions, they use this example called Flatland because it's just the best example we got. It's based on
I'm sure you're just going to say it. It's based on Edwin Abbott, I think was his name, right?
Yep.
The first person I heard talk about this was probably like 15, 20 years ago. It was Carl Sagan, and he's giving a presentation. You can look it up on YouTube. It's called Carl Sagan Fourth Dimension. Okay. And it's a fantastic presentation. And this was 20 years ago. I was probably like 15. And as I'm watching this thing, and I was Christian then too, as I'm watching this thing and he's talking about this and Sagan's like very anti-God. He's not giving glory to Christ through this explanation by any means, right? As he's talking about this concept and explaining, I'm like, oh my God, that's how Jesus appeared in closed rooms. Mm-hmm. That's how people transported from here to there. Like it literally all made sense. That was the first time that I started asking weird questions like this because of Carl Sagan, who's like an atheist, giving an explanations of how dimensions actually work. And so now go into what it means, okay? Or how it's explained.
And isn't that amazing too, that because the church doesn't talk about this stuff by and large, some do, but because they don't, we have to go to atheistic sources to even begin to start a journey in understanding this.
And thank God I was already saved.
Yeah.
Because if I wasn't, I would have just followed in the interpretation of Carl Sagan.
Exactly.
You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
So if we just owned these topics and gave satisfactory answers to people who are critical thinkers, maybe we wouldn't lose so many kids in high school or in high school, college. You know what I mean? Where people tend to fall off. Okay. Explain Flatland because this is exciting.
Yeah, and I love it because this is the closest that we can get to understanding what a fourth dimensional reality would be like. And the first step is just understanding you're never going to be able to visualize it. You're never going to be able to, and that's okay. We're not meant to, but that doesn't mean that we can't know things about it. So the whole concept of Flatland is imagine there's a two-dimensional universe, flat. They don't have up or down. And, imagine that there are beings called Flatlanders that exist in this universe. And the universe doesn't have to be very big. It could just be the size of your tabletop or, maybe hovering like 2 or 3 feet off your tabletop or something.
Could be like a sheet of paper.
Yeah, exactly. And it's empty space and they exist in there. They can move around in there, but they don't have access to up or down. Something has been cut off from them, which I could talk about that too, because I actually just did a video on that. What the sword in the that turns every which way in the Garden of Eden was actually cutting. But we can get into that a little later.
Let me write that down.
Imagine that Flatland. It's cut off from the third dimension, which generally we would say is the z-axis, up and down. So they have forward, backward. They have left and right. No up or down. Well, imagine if Flatland's right here, and let's say I want to put a three-dimensional object in Flatland, but they don't have up or down. How would they see that? Like how would they, like, if they're looking at it, how would they see it? And there's a bunch of examples of this, but a common example is, well, if you drop a ball through Flatland, you could drop the ball. The Flatlander eventually will see every part of that ball, but it sees it in stages. So first, when the ball breaches Flatland, they'll just see a point in space, like just in front of them. If you drop it right in front of them, they'll just see a point, and then they'll see something start to expand. Now, imagine their perspective. They're looking straight ahead. They're only seeing kind of like a line, but they could probably, if they traveled around it, they could put together that it's a circle. Just like, if I have a ball in my hand, I can't see all sides of that ball, but I can turn it around and see that it's a ball. It's the same kind of thing. So they are seeing a circle, but they're seeing it just like as a line in front of them. So they see a point, and as the ball goes through flatland, this point expands out bigger and bigger until the full circumference of the ball is like the ball is halfway through flatland.
Yeah.
And then they'll see that line shrink and disappear as the ball falls out. They wouldn't know what they were looking at. They would have no clue to put that together, that's a three-dimensional image. It's the same if you do it with a cube. It would be the same thing, but it would be a square. Now, again, they're looking straight ahead, so they would see a line, or if the corner is in front of them, they might see, but they would be able to perceive that it's a square. Right. Now, if you wanted to show as much as you could of a cube to a flatlander, how could you do that? Well, one thing, and this goes into a whole other thing that we can get into later if you guys want. But one thing is, and it's a big term, but I'll explain it. And by the way, just for the audience, don't get intimidated by these smart aleck scientists that want to use these big terms. Really, what they're doing is they're trying to, and I shouldn't generalize, not all of them are like this, but this language is created to make them look like they are so smart you can't possibly understand it. But really what it is they're kind of speaking a different language almost. Like that's all it is. And once you can kind of understand what they're talking about, it's not that like the words are just so complicated that you couldn't possibly understand. Anybody could understand this fine. It's just this, it should be the scientist's job to speak in a language that everybody can understand. So it's called extra dimensional unfolding. A really big word, but all it means is, like, you take a cube, let's say flatland is right here on my table. I take a cube, I put it down, and let's say it's hollow so I can actually unfold this thing. Well, when you unfold a cube, you get 6 squares. 6 squares can be folded up to make a cube, and the 6 squares look like a cross. It's it's like that shape.
I'm drawing it right now because these are very visual topics. Yeah. You know what I mean? And there's such good representations out there if people want to look it up. But if you unfolded if you unfolded a cube, it would look like that. It literally would look like a cross, right?
Yep.
1,
so
2, 3, 4, 5, you got
6. Well, you would have 2 on the bottom there, but it's basically the same thing. There Correct. You go. You got it. That's it. So a flatlander could see now the flatlander could see every side of that cube. The flatlander can't put together what that shape is supposed to look like in its natural 3-dimensional environment, but it has access to the most amount of information possible from that cube. It basically has all of it. It doesn't know up or down, so it can't put it together in its head. Right. So let's take that one dimension up. Let's say if there was a cube of 4 spatial dimensions instead of 3. And there's actually a name for it. It's called a hypercube. So if a 4th dimensional being, a being of one more spatial dimension than us, wanted to show us what a hypercube would look like, how could it do that? Well, it could do the exact same thing. It could unfold it, except instead of squares, we get cubes. And because we get 1 extra dimension, we get 2 extra arms to the cross. So basically, it's a stack of 4 cubes. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then on the 3rd cube, on each of the 4 sides, there's 4 more cubes. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's like a cross with 2 extra arms.
Dennis, Google this.
It's called a tesseract.
Okay. Dennis, Google it. You're going to screen share. We need to see these things. Because it makes sense it makes more sense when you see it.
Absolutely. And that's the hardest part about sometimes doing interviews like this and trying to just convey it with language, because visuals really help. Yeah. And in my book, Quantum Creation, it was the first book that I'd done on this topic. So those are the hypercubes. And
but they're not stacked. Like I was looking for like this one kind of is.
Yeah, that's a tesseract. Yeah, there you go.
Click that one.
Yeah, so see how it's 4 cubes from bottom to top, and then you got 1 cube on each side.
Yeah.
So it's as if the arms of the cross are going out left, right, forward, back.
Yes. So that's what a hypercube would look like if it was unfolded into our dimension and we could have access to the most amount of information about it. Now, just like the Flatlander cannot look at the two-dimensional cross and put together a cube because they don't have up or down, well, we don't have these extra 2 dimensions, or this extra 1 dimension, these extra 2 directions. We don't have those other 2, so we can't put together what that would really look like in its natural four-dimensional state. Right. So the best that we could have is that.
So that is one way that it helped me understand these concepts is as you what's it called? Descend, right? Into a lower dimension, you're limited to that dimension.
Yes.
Higher dimensional beings, entities, objects, shapes, higher dimensional objects cannot exist in a lower dimensional plane because that lower dimensional plane doesn't have all of the directions available to it.
Only a slice of them can.
Yeah. Only a slice.
So they technically can. Like I could, if Flatland were real, I could put my finger in Flatland and I could move it around and they would see basically a circle, but again, it's not, they're not looking at it top down. Sometimes that confuses people. When I say they see a circle, I don't mean that they're literally seeing like a circle like in front of them.
They're seeing the walls around the circle.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. They can perceive the circle in the way that we can perceive a sphere if we're looking at a ball. But I can exist in Flatland, but I can't exist as a Flatlander.
Right.
I can, and there's a really interesting correlation here. So I can put my finger in Flatland, move it around. I can put 2 fingers in Flatland, go like this, and they're going to think that's 2 different objects if they're looking at it as a cross section from right here. Now, this gets into some really interesting territory because how many lay people who have no background in quantum physics have reported seeing UFOs that do this exact thing, but in 3 dimensions? It's a point and it blows up. It splits off into 2. It splits off into 3. They move all around independently. They come back together and they disappear. Well, that makes perfect sense if there's higher dimensions.
Exactly.
And because that's what you would expect. And you don't even need technology to do that. If a Flatland universe existed, I don't need technology to put my finger in there or to walk through it or to somewhat interact with it. I just can't fully interact in the way that a Flatlander can. I would be the extra dimensional being in that scenario. And you get all of these lay people, none of them have background in physics, and they're explaining this extra dimensional stuff that they should have no way of knowing about. And to me, that lends evidence that this is probably real. There must be higher dimensions. I think higher dimensions are what we would call, the spirit world or, heaven, hell. There's anything beyond the 3 dimension, just anything beyond physicality, the 3 dimensions of space and one of time as we know it.
Yeah, that's great. Because that's the first time I started seeing these orbs and things change in shape in the sky and appearing, disappearing, defying the laws of physics and all of these disclosures that are going on now. The first thing that popped into my mind is interdimensional. That's the first thing that popped into my mind. And it's all because of this video that I saw 15 years ago from an atheist scientist. You know what I mean? Explaining just how dimensions work. Like he wasn't talking about how there could be other beings and they might be aliens and there's no God. And he wasn't getting into that. Just the foundational understanding of this is how dimensions work. And so when a higher dimensional being or object interacts with a lower dimension, that object or being is limited to that dimension. You can unpack it, like you were saying, and they could kind of understand what that object looks like in their dimension, but they cannot understand what its full what it fully looks like, what its entire shape is like, because they're limited to that lower dimension. And so for us to be like, well, let's just hypothetically say angels are in the 4th dimension. Demons are in the fourth dimension, right? The spiritual realms in the fourth dimension. For us to be like, well, what do they look like? You know, for us to do that is completely impossible because we're limited to our third dimension. Everything we know has forward, back, up, down, left, right. There isn't anything in our there's nothing in our third dimension that's even 2D. There's nothing in our third dimension that's perfectly flat.
Right.
Everything in our dimension has up and down. Everything has some kind of volume, a cell, right? Everything has some kind of volume, except for maybe like, I don't know, light or something. I don't know what. There's one more thing to note before we go on. If people are following along, man, I hope you are, you know, because this stuff's so exciting. But in one of the things in that video, okay, that Sagan talks about, he says that because the Flatlanders, you know, are limited to their second dimension and there's no up and down, their houses, and this is a great example, their houses would just be little squares, right? Or little triangles, whatever shape their house is.
Yep, they don't need a floor, they don't need a roof.
It would have walls, but they don't have floors and roofs because there's no direction to look up to see a roof or to build a roof. Everything is perfectly flat, right? And so he gives the example of like, okay, if there's a 3-dimensional, and he holds up an orange, you know, he's like, or an apple, and he's like, if there's a 3-dimensional entity outside of the second dimension, it's above. And when the Flatlanders are like, where's above? They have no idea because they can't look up. There's no third dimension for them. They just look around, right, in their second dimension. So if a 3rd-dimensional apple looks at the Flatlander in his house, he's looking into the building because he's up and there's no roof. So to me, the second I heard that, I'm like, oh, and he said, and if he wanted to engage with the Flatlander and enter into the space, he would just, the 3rd-dimensional object would just appear.
Yep.
Because he's coming down from this other dimension and he pops into the second, right?
Yep. So
I'm like, oh my God, that's what Jesus did when he entered the locked room, right?
Exactly.
They specifically say the door was locked in the upper room where everybody was trembling and fearful and praying, and Jesus just poof, appears into their building. That's because he comes from a higher dimension.
Exactly.
And he doesn't need to go through a door. He doesn't need to go through the roof because whatever the 4th dimension is, and just like the Flatlander can't look up or point to his buddy and be like, it's over there, you know? We can't be like, well, Jesus comes from over there. Like we can't do it because it's outside of our ability as 3-dimensional beings. But when you see these orbs that are on the news now and that there's disclosures in the Pentagon, Tucker Carlson's talking about them now. If you've watched, he just put out an interview with Joe Rogan where he talks about how he thinks UFOs are interdimensional and spiritual. Okay. It's becoming very, very mainstream now, these concepts. So as Christians, if we don't have explanations for what these things are, these are the guys that are going to run with these topics and give us or give the masses something to believe.
That's right.
You know? Okay, so that's a good intro to what dimensions are. Okay, hopefully people checked along.